Welcome to the Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us David Dylan Thomas. Hi, David.
Hello, Alexandria. How you doing?
I'm good. David is the founder and CEO of David Dylan Thomas, LLC, and the author of Design for Cognitive Bias. And he is going to talk a little bit about cognitive bias and how L&D professionals can leverage that today. But before we jump into that conversation, let's chat a little bit about your career, your background. So tell us, how did you get to this point where you are today?
So I started out in the world of content strategy and UX, helping build websites, helping do content migrations, a lot of really difficult work. And so that was my day job. But at the same time, I've always been adjacent to people who knew a lot about the brain. So my mother went to UCLA and majored in psychiatry or psychology. My wife is a pediatric neuropsychologist. So I've always been adjacent to people who are really curious about the brain, and I kind of inherited that, like almost by osmosis. And then finally, I saw this one talk by Iris Bonet called Gender Equality by Design, where she was, linking things we knew about the brain to things we knew about design. And that just kind of lit a fire under me. And I ended up teaching myself everything I could about cognitive bias, eventually doing a podcast about it, and eventually giving a lot of talks and writing a book about it, basically where it intersected with web design, content strategy, all that good stuff. That book went well enough where I basically quit my day job doing content strategy and UX. And now I do full-time doing lectures and workshops around making your design choices more inclusive and kind of trying to account for bias.
I just thought of an idea. I don't know if this is actually a real thing, but a question popped into my head. What's the most common cognitive bias that you help folks design around to be more inclusive?
That is a good question. I would say that confirmation bias is the most common in that most biases are kind of one form or another of confirmation bias. But then B, I think it's the one people are most familiar with. And the thing basically, and to explain confirmation bias is you get an idea stuck in your head and you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you ever see evidence that doesn't support that idea, you basically yell fake news and you move on. But, as practitioners, really of any kind, it can be easiest to get locked into one idea, one way to solve a particular problem. And there may be tons of easier ways to do it. But once we kind of lock in on that, we kind of just look for evidence to support, that's right. I'm definitely on the right track here. And it can be really difficult to get ourselves out of that. In fact, they invented the scientific method specifically to get people out of that, because the whole point of the scientific method isn't get other people to try your work. It is try to actively disprove what you think is true. So if I think that gravity is the thing, right, I have to try to do experiments to prove that it doesn't work, right? And if I can't do that, okay, then maybe gravity's real. But it isn't just, this thing keeps falling on the floor every time, gravity must be real. No, you got to do harder work than that.
That made me realize that maybe I should back up so that we can define what cognitive bias is.
Excellent. Yes.
That would be helpful.
Yeah. So cognitive bias is basically when a shortcut goes wrong. So you have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about what to do with my hands, where to look, how fast to talk. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I would never get anything done. Mm-hmm. So it is actually a blessing that most of our lives are spent on autopilot. We make these decisions so fast, we don't even realize we've made them. That is 90% of the time a good thing. But every now and then, the shortcut gets it wrong. And we call those errors cognitive biases, right? So if I'm playing a game where I have to roll a die and I need a really high number, I tend to roll the die really hard. If I need a lower number, I tend to roll it really gently. And when you step back and think about that, you're like, that makes no sense. But it feels right, because when we're in situations where we have no control, we want to feel like we have control. And so we embody that by how hard we roll the die, right? So that's technically an error, right? It's a bias called illusion of control. And it's, a fairly harmless one, but that is your mind taking a shortcut that doesn't really make sense.
It reminds me of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Yes.
And Is it Aaron Tversky? I met
Tversky, yeah, that's who we did the research with, so that when I did a podcast called the Cognitive Bias Podcast, and literally every other episode I bring up that book and some experiment they did, and it's so funny. I actually got to meet Dr. Kahneman very briefly at an event. He sat down for lunch, and everyone else was cool about it, and I was trying not to fanboy out, and I was like, okay, I'll play cool, and then 5 minutes in, I'm like, oh my god, Dr. Kahneman, I have this podcast, and every episode I mention you, and you're awesome. Okay, I'll shut up now. And he was super gracious about it, but it was total, yeah.
So the way that that's amazing, by the way. I absolutely love that. I have his book, Noise, but I haven't, and that's more of decision making.
Yeah.
Really been able to finish or delve too far into that one yet to say anything coherent about it.
Yeah, I've got that on my shelf too. It is among the many books I've yet to read.
I started it though, and I was like, oh, this is going to be a game changer. So I want to go back to your definition about cognitive bias. I wanted to see if there was a distinction, clarification between. So I asked about Daniel Kahneman because I think he calls things like heuristics and biases.
Yeah.
That and a lot of psychology research does that might not necessarily be a mistake. It's just an intentional shortcut that we do. I'm thinking about in memory, recency effect, primacy effect, the first thing that you're exposed to and the last thing that you're exposed to can be the most memorable. And I guess that's not necessarily something that goes wrong, but something that our brain has a tendency to do just by nature of trying to be efficient as efficient as possible. And so just by knowing that, you can be intentional about maybe the most important thing you do, or you reinforce something that is the most important in the beginning and in the end. And that could kind of go into the designing for bias. So I'm so excited to talk to you today about how people can be intentional about some of these biases and use them, leverage that in the way that they work as L&D professionals. So one thing I wanted to chat with you about is I see a lot of folks who come to our webinars, and I said this when I was talking to Chris Neubauer a few weeks ago. They say, can you come and say this to my senior leader? Or how do I make the case to our senior leaders? Yes, we definitely want this coaching program or whatever it is, but there's a big but. We need to make the case for it. We need to convince someone. And I think that you might have some ideas or strategies that people could use for that, tackling that problem.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it turns out there's a lot you can do. The whole middle chapter of my book is devoted to what I call stakeholder bias, right? So when I say stakeholder, I'm usually talking about people who decide how you spend your day. It could be a boss, it could be a client, it could be a colleague. But those folks are just as susceptible to bias as we are, as our audiences. And so loss aversion would be an example of that. So let's say that you're trying to make the case to your boss that this software that we've been forced to use to design our learning design platform is just, everyone knows it's terrible, and we keep investing in it because we've got a contract with IT and blah, blah, blah. And nothing you say seems to make a difference. So where loss aversion comes in, loss aversion is this idea that it hurts twice as much to lose something as it feels good to get something. So it hurts twice as much to lose $10 as it feels good to just find $10 in your couch. And where that comes into play with your bosses is, if your company is loss averse, risk averse, it's usually better to point out the downside of not taking a risk than the upside of taking the risk, right? So if I go into the boss and say, hey, this LMS we've been using this is terrible, and I've got this new one, and it's really bright and shiny, and everyone's going to love them. We're going to make so much more money and get so much more teaching done, right? That is weirdly not as convincing as walking in and saying, hey, this LMS that we've been using if we keep using it, here's how many people are going to quit. Here's how long it's going to take to find the replacement. Here is how long it's going to take to train their replacements. And here's how much productivity is going to go down. Well, all of that is happening. By the time you finish painting that apocalyptic picture, all of a sudden getting that fancy new LMS sounds like a great idea, right? So that's one example of taking an existing bias that most people have, loss aversion, and saying, okay, if I frame the picture I'm trying to draw you in this way, you'll be much more receptive, and you'll get it in a way that you might not get it if I just try to point out how rosy everything could be.
That was such a great example. Oh, I love that. And it reminds me of a conversation that you and I had about that they're leveraging existing beliefs. That makes it much easier. I think we had had a conversation about behavior change. So I'll just drop that back in here now. Maybe you can help differentiate or clear up like the difference between, is this a behavior change task that you're asking people to get better at, or what is it exactly?
Yeah, I think there are two types of change we look for in our leadership. One is behavior change, where they're doing this thing and we wish they would just stop and do something else. And there's belief change where, okay, they fundamentally don't believe in the mission of our thing, and I wish they did, right? And those can have the same result of, okay, they're doing this thing I don't like, but they are two completely different kinds of change that you're advocating for that require two completely different tactics. So let me give you an example that I like from politics. So Stacey Abrams was trying to convince the Tea Party to vote against anti-environmental legislation. Now, if she wanted to change their beliefs, what she would have done is gone in there and tried to convince them that climate change is real and it's a threat and they need to vote against the legislation for that reason. She knew that wouldn't work. That was simply something they didn't believe, and trying to get them to believe it is a much longer project. Instead, she tried to convince them that property taxes were real, right? Because they already believe in, like, taxes for them are the big issue. They're the thing that keeps them up at night. So she said, which was true, that if this anti-environmental legislation went through, that the property taxes would decline because the erosion of the soil bed would just ruin the property and yada, yada, yada. If you believe in like these, property taxes being viable, you need to vote against this legislation. Not a word about climate change, not a word about trying to change their beliefs, just changing their behavior, right? So she keyed into something they believed already and said, if you really believe in this, you're going to change your behavior this way. And they did. That to me is a good example of, you can change the behavior, you can change the belief, but you're going to have to use completely different tactics. So in the short term, I think a lot of these business cases we're making are about understanding what the person you're trying to convince, understanding what drives them, what's keeping them up at night, and then framing what you want to do in terms of that, rather than saying, here's this whole other belief system I want you to adopt. Oh, and by the way, here's a whole other course of action you need to take now that you have this whole new belief system.
I love that you gave that example and the way that you differentiate it, because it actually seems like it's just a hack. Because if it's doing behavior change, a lot of those models do start with changing an existing belief or value, and that's a lot of work. But in this example, you're bypassing that step. You can jump to the behaviors and the actions and the outcomes and the process and the things, the actions, because you're able to take advantage of or tap into an existing belief that already happens. And that seems so much more manageable, so much more doable than being like, I need to change some belief and value systems out here in my organization to fix our culture, whatever the problem is. Like, that's just so much more work.
Yeah. And I want to be clear. I'm not saying that either option is any more morally viable. I think there are moral imperatives around both. And both should be approached, right? Because if you just try to do the behavior change and don't even touch or just try to do the belief change and don't touch the behavior change, a lot of people are going to get hurt in the short term. If you just focus on the behavior change, not the belief change, you're just going to keep coming back around to bad behavior. So I think you kind of have to attack both at the same time. And it may even take completely different skill sets and completely different teams to do that. But it is important to know the difference so that you know what you're going for in that moment, right? Am I trying to get you to believe in climate change, or am I just trying to make sure this particular legislation doesn't pass right now?
Yeah. Okay. That's a cool example. So let's talk about some strategies that if I want to persuade someone who is in my organization, I want to tap into cognitive biases and use them for my advantage. What strategies am I going to use?
So here's another one that I call stakeholder inception, which is basically the idea that it is better. It's one thing for someone to think that your idea is a good idea. It's something entirely for them to think that it was their idea all along. And this is a very tricky, like salesy technique. And it sounds really sketchy, but there's an example I want to give that's less sketchy, I guess. So I had a client who was convinced that this particular content they had to stay behind a paywall, right? Nothing from the analytics showed that to be true. Nobody was really paying for it. Nothing from the user research indicated that was true. When we asked people, they said they didn't want to pay for it. But they were insistent it had to be this way. So instead of just saying over and over again, no, change it, right? We said, okay, we're going to do a brainstorming exercise where first we want you to list the top 10 reasons you're making that content. And so they listed that out. And then we said, okay, well, we talked to your users. Here are the top 10 reasons they're looking for that content. So we put those two lists side by side and we said, okay, brainstorming exercise. How might we use content to make these two lists happy? And we let them go and do the exercise. And we came back later. And one of the ideas they came up with on their own was, what if we took this content and pulled it out from behind the paywall? And we were like, that's great. I'm so glad that you came up with that idea. What a great idea you've come up with. We should do it. And the beauty of this is twofold. One, I actually think this is kind of a more honest approach because instead of me coming in and saying, hey, we did all this research, we think you should do this. It's, hey, we did all this research. What do you think we should do? Right? And in that scenario, maybe they come up with an even better idea, right? I don't know. But the other thing about it is if it's my idea that they adopt, when the going gets tough, they can just say, oh, that was Dave's idea. You know how he is, right? And then just drop it. If it's their idea, when the going gets tough, they're going to stick to it because it's their idea. They're invested in it now, right? So that's another way of like, and these are all bundled with biases that we have about identity and like the stuff that we discover versus the stuff that's kind of forced on us. Like there's a lot around the kind of mores that we have for ourselves. We cling to much more dearly than anything that someone tries to push on us. So all of those biases are kind of in a whirlpool there. But the intended effect is to have someone arrive at an idea on their own rather than just accept my idea because I'm so smart.
I was going to say, I think there's an Office episode around this exact
I would not be surprised.
I'm like, oh, but I wonder, I was like, as you're describing it, I'm like, was it that Michael actually came up with the idea himself, or I think he just took the credit, but as soon as it started to go south, he was like, it was not my idea. But still, like you could see where they could have maybe been more strategic about telling him, convincing him it was his own idea. It's kind of funny. Just popped into my head. Okay, I want to go back to, you mentioned that you were a content strategist before you wrote your book. And I had mentioned to you that we are in the process at ATD migrating over our CMS right now to a new system, which is a lot of behind the scenes work to rebuild pages. And I don't even know the in-depth process that the IT team and probably all sorts of other people have done to make that a reality. And not just a headache. So something you said, we put in a pin in it, but I want to return. You had said that there's lots of biases that can come out when doing something like content migration. So I want to ask you about that now. What does that mean?
So there's a ton. One is just, I think earlier we had mentioned how it always takes longer than you think. There's literally a bias around scoping where people will always think it's going to take less time to do a thing than it actually is. There's a word for it that I forget, but that's actually typical. There's also status quo bias. I've worked on a lot of content migration projects, and content migration projects are almost never about technology and almost always about people and bias. It's what do you believe about your company? What do you believe about your content? What do you believe about how people should work together? How should information be organized? And it all just comes out. It's like going into therapy. Like all the stuff that's just sort of been under the surface in a company, all the political stuff, all the gossipy stuff, it all comes out because when you do a content migration, you are changing everything, right? You are basically saying, hey, everything, it's like moving. Hey, everything in this house is going to change. What are we going to keep? What are we going to throw away? Are we going to move all of it? Are we going to put it exactly where it was before? We can't, because that's not how the new system works, right? There's all these things. Accessibility suddenly becomes an issue in a way that it might not have before. When you have the opportunity to quote unquote start from scratch, everyone who thinks you should change things is going to come out of the woodwork, and everyone who thinks you shouldn't change things is going to come out of the woodwork, right? Because now there are stakes. And there's a ton of biases bubbled up under that. But status quo bias is a big one. And that's just simply, I prefer things the way they are, even if they could maybe be better. It's just scarier. So let's just stay with the devil we know. So that comes up. But yeah, like every content migration I've done is emotional. Like, and it's like 90% emotional labor and 10% actual, spreadsheets.
But good to know that if you know that in advance going in, because then you can help people prepare for it. And even as I think about it, it's like that, our process, it has been a slow on-ramp and lots of people involved. And I do think that they were doing that intentionally to make sure it wasn't just like, all right, in 2 weeks, we're going to move everything over and it's going to be super disruptive. Yeah. I'm sure there's wins and, challenges and not challenges for both ways.
Well, yeah. And I've found that like a strategy that works pretty well with this is triage and expectation setting. Like when I say it's mostly emotional labor, that's a lot of it is expectation setting, figuring out the politics, figuring out who needs to know what when, and really just sort of being like, hey, you're not going to come into the office tomorrow and everything's going to be different, which is a good thing because you don't want that, actually. That'll freak people out. It's like, here's what's going to change. Here's when it's going to change. Like, if you think about it, like the political process in the United States, fraught as it has been, is something people don't usually freak out too much about, which if you think about how much actually changes, like you're going to change who's in charge of the entire country. You're going to change who's in charge of your city. You're usually going to swap out a ton of the staff, all sorts of policies. And like, it is a lot, but it's also a lot of expectation setting. We're usually used to, this is about when people are going to start campaigning for that office, right? This is about when people are going to register to vote. This is about when I'm going to start seeing posters on people's lawns, right? There's a lot of expectation setting so that when it's not like we go to sleep one day and then tomorrow someone new is in charge of the country and we're like, wait, what happened? Right? No, we over a course of years measure out this is when things are going to change and blah, 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 blah. And again, even as fraught as it has been, it's way less problematic than it could be, right? If it was just, wait, why is this a lot different now? What happened?
Yeah. Oh, I'm imagining our listeners are thinking about projects that they have where you don't need to do expectation setting for everything. In fact, you could probably disgruntle some folks if you are making a big communications and extra over communications about something that is, I don't know, just like a one-time offering or something that's smaller. So trying to pick and choose what makes the most sense to kind of set those expectations in advance and do that extra legwork.
Yeah. And it ends up being a lot more about communications and all of that. I mean, yes, you have to make important decisions about what's going to go where and how that's going to be different. But it's also as much about once all of that has changed, is anyone going to use it? Right?
Okay. So any other biases that we haven't gotten to talk about that you think might be good for the L&D community to have up their sleeve or be thinking about or mindful of in terms of the work they do?
I mean, one other that I think is really important, especially if you're talking about that bigger change, which I'd like to get into a little more, going back toward kind of belief or system change, is this thing called consistency bias. And the way it works is if I were to come up to you and say, hey, Alexandria, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You'd probably say no, right? But if instead I said, hey, can I put this just tiny itty bitty little sign? It's like a micro dot. You won't even notice it. You're more likely to say yes. If you say yes, and I come back 2 weeks later and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're actually more likely to say yes now because you're a sign person now, right? We'd like to make decisions that are consistent with our former decisions, right? It goes back to that identity thing. So if I'm going to roll out like a more inclusive approach at my company that's doing L&D, I could say, hey, we're going to have the inclusive redesign meeting committee, and we're going to have meetings every Monday, and we're going to overhaul everything over the next 3 years. Okay, that is generally just going to be a way to generate more meetings. Or I could say, hey, on this next project, can we do this one little tweak? It's called an assumption on it. It's a meeting. This is a real thing. It's a meeting where we talk about our assumptions and our identities and how that might impact the design and who's not in the room and how their absence might impact the design. It's like a 2-hour meeting, right? Can we just get that in the budget? Can we get that on the books? Just 2 hours. This is going to be like a 100-hour project anyway. That's more likely to get a yes. If I get a yes and I do those meetings on like the next 5 projects and I come back and say, hey, for this next one, can we have like this red team exercise? Again, this is a real thing where we have this whole other team come in just for one day to kind of check our work and make sure we're not putting something harmful into the lesson. It takes a day, but this is like a 100-day project, right? More likely to say yes, because I guess we're inclusive design people now, right? So it's a way of thinking at broader change. So you're kind of incorporating both sides. So there's little tiny behavior step changes, right? We're making something a part of the process, but with a goal toward like making it part of like the template of just this is how we do things. That speaks more to that bigger change. I find that to be, and again, going back to your point earlier of like what seems manageable versus what seems impossible, like rather than try to boil the ocean on day one, you say, what's one little change I can make? And this is important, get into the budget, get into the template, get into the way we always do things so that I don't have to fight for it next time. And then I can add another one of those, right? And another one. And before you know it, wait, everything we do here is more inclusive. What happens?
Ooh, I love that advice. Yeah. Okay, I know we could keep talking about this forever, but we both have things to do after this conversation. So we're going to switch gears for now and chat a little bit about your learning goals. So how are you growing and getting out of your comfort zone lately?
So, and this is complex, but I've found that I always like finding speakers that challenge me. There's this guy named Bio. I'm blanking on his last name. I'll send it to you later so you can put it in the show notes or something. But he gives talks that really challenge me, and he's working in the space that he calls post activism, where rather than like design likes to go in there and think I can fix it. Let's fix it. And then very often ends up making it worse, and B, kind of just propagating the system you're trying to undo. And this is kind of what I was hinting at before, like with incremental change versus system change. I think a lot of people right now are crying out justly for systems change. But I think we're approaching it in this very old school kind of like, oh, let's just go in and fix it. We'll use design to fix it. And I think, and it's hard to talk about because it is literally hard to talk about. That's a lot of what he talks about is I want to describe things that are hard to describe. I want to challenge that what you're trying to do doesn't fit easily into words. And that's kind of what I'm learning now is like, how do I think about these concepts, because I'm used to that let's go in and fix it approach. That was what I used to do for a living. How do I address these bigger world issues in a way that is more about thinking about harmony and communication and like things working together and going to local expertise, right? And power that's out of the edges. It's a lot of like big concepts. But that's kind of why it's a learning goal, because even mapping that space is a bit of a learning goal. But the short version, I guess, is how do I get outside of my comfort zone of let's just go in and fix it when I find that approach is actually lacking.
It makes me go back to the conversation we were having about belief change and behavior change, where getting down to the root, the beliefs and the values is more systemic.
Yes.
From the actions, right? So
yeah, and that's the challenge, right? Like the nice thing about behavior is it's easy to describe. Belief is actually a bit more fuzzy, so operating at that level gets trickier, and that's the learning goal. Is like, how do I really think about that part?
Cool. Well, sounds like you're doing awesome, fun stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing where that journey takes you. Where can folks tune in and keep up with your activity?
Sure. Just go to daviddylan.thomas.com. You can find my book there. You can book me to speak or do trainings there, or just, learn about what I'm getting up to.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was so nice to chat with you today.
Great to talk to you too.